December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay under a brittle layer of snow, pale light filtering through skeletal trees. A sharp wind whispered through the ridges, carrying the distant crack of rifle fire and the low rumble of artillery. German soldiers crouched in frozen foxholes, breath fogging in the icy air, eyes straining through the gray fog that clung to every branch. Here, in this dense tangle of trees and narrow roads, the Wehrmacht believed itself untouchable, a fortress carved by nature itself. On the other side, American armored units waited in uneasy silence. Tracks of Sherman tanks pressed into the snow, engines idling beneath the cover of pines. Scouts moved cautiously, the crunch of frozen leaves underfoot betraying their presence. Intelligence reports warned of a German counteroffensive, but few could imagine the scale or speed of what was coming. Every officer, every soldier, knew the Ardennes was supposed to be impassable in winter. Yet somewhere beyond the fog, German armor gathered, poised to challenge that belief, to ignite a battle that would test every command, every tactic, and every ounce of courage in the forest. The Ardennes was about to bleed fire. By late 1944, Europe had entered a phase of relentless attrition. The Allies had broken out from Normandy, rolling through France, liberating towns, cities, and countryside in rapid succession. The German army, battered and overstretched, clung desperately to the Western Front. Fuel shortages, depleted manpower, and fractured supply lines left the Wehrmacht vulnerable, yet stubbornly determined to resist. Hitler, increasingly isolated in his decision-making, sought a bold maneuver to reverse the momentum of the Allies, a gamble that relied as much on audacity as it did on the geography of the land itself. The Ardennes forest stretched across Belgium, Luxembourg, and northeastern France, a labyrinth of dense pine, steep ridges, and narrow winding roads. To the German high command it was a natural bulwark, a landscape that could slow any attacking force to a crawl. They believed it impenetrable for large mechanized units, particularly in winter when snow and ice transformed its paths into treacherous ribbons. The Americans had deployed relatively inexperienced troops in the region, many of whom had been rushed into the line after the Normandy campaign. Intelligence suggested that the Ardennes' quiet woods would provide a temporary buffer, a miscalculation that would soon prove catastrophic. German forces in the region were positioned in depth. Units of the 6th Panzer Army and the 5th Panzer Army occupied forward defensive posts, supported by infantry divisions and elements of the Waffen-SS. Commanders like General Hasso von Manteuffel oversaw armored divisions, while their infantry counterparts fortified road junctions and choke points. Soldiers were acutely aware of the winter's cruelty. Frostbite claimed as many men as bullets in some sectors. Despite this, morale was sustained by the belief that the Ardennes offered a natural shield, a barrier that could delay or even halt an Allied advance. Meanwhile, the American forces were stretched thin. The U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies, advancing rapidly through France and Belgium, faced logistical strains of their own. Supplies had to move along narrow roads, often congested with vehicles, artillery, and convoys. Intelligence underestimated German strength in the Ardennes. Many commanders assumed that snow and forest would make any offensive slow and limited. The reality on the ground was starkly different. The Ardennes, while inhospitable, offered concealment for concentrated armored units. The dense woods masked the movement of tanks and trucks, allowing German forces to assemble unseen, ready to strike at weak points. The Allies' focus had been elsewhere. Antwerp, with its port facilities, was the key logistical prize. Supply chains depended on rapid capture and clearance of the surrounding regions. The Ardennes, by contrast, was considered a backwater, sparsely defended, lightly monitored, and unsuitable for a major offensive. American reconnaissance patrols reported minimal enemy activity, reinforcing the illusion that the forest was a quiet flank rather than a threat. German planners exploited this complacency, positioning divisions behind snow-draped ridges, camouflaging tanks beneath pine branches, and stockpiling fuel and munitions in hidden clearings. The political stakes mirrored the military urgency. Hitler envisioned a winter offensive that would fracture the Allied front, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated settlement in the West. Failure, however, promised devastation. The Ardennes terrain would amplify both the risks and the opportunities. Narrow roads funneled movement, creating potential choke points for attackers or defenders. Rivers and ridges dictated maneuver, forcing commanders to coordinate every advance with painstaking precision. In this environment, a single misstep could cascade into disaster. Yet the Germans believed in the forest's power. Maps annotated with contour lines, forest density, and road grades reinforced their confidence. Supply units labored to move tanks and artillery silently through snow, while reconnaissance parties monitored American positions, noting gaps in coverage and weaknesses in forward units. Commanders studied the terrain obsessively. Even the smallest villages became critical nodes, capable of controlling access to surrounding ridges and valleys. Soldiers trudged through snow, shivering but disciplined, understanding that each ridge, each frozen stream, could become a decisive battlefield. As winter deepened, the Ardennes took on an almost otherworldly stillness. Snow muffled the sounds of distant artillery. Fog settled over the valleys, reducing visibility to mere yards. American troops patrolled cautiously, unaware that German armor was massing just beyond the ridges. Every frozen road, every snow-laden tree would soon become a corridor of war. And in those quiet, deceptive woods, the stage was being set for one of the most audacious armored offensives of the war. In the weeks that followed, the Ardennes would no longer be a quiet forest. It would become a crucible, a place where strategy, technology, human endurance, and sheer audacity would collide in days that would test the limits of every soldier on both sides. As December deepened, the Ardennes' deceptive calm concealed a storm of preparation. Hitler's plan, later codified as Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, was audacious. A rapid thrust through the forest, aiming to split the Allied forces, seize Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into negotiation. The concept relied on surprise, speed, and the assumption that the Allies would dismiss the Ardennes as impassable. Commanders meticulously studied maps, measured road widths, and coordinated the movement of hundreds of tanks, self-propelled guns, and trucks. The forest itself, once a natural barrier, became an ally for the Wehrmacht, hiding movements from aerial reconnaissance and delaying the enemy's awareness. Allied intelligence, by contrast, failed to perceive the full scale of the German buildup. Intercepts suggested only minor troop movements. Reconnaissance flights over the Ardennes reported limited activity due to persistent fog and low cloud cover. Patrolling units noted occasional convoys, but nothing alarming. The Americans considered the Ardennes a quiet sector, a back door through which no large-scale offensive could pass in winter. Generals Bradley and Hodges focused on maintaining the pressure elsewhere, diverting resources to the Scheldt and the approaches to Antwerp. Even when reports of increased German presence trickled in, they were dismissed as routine defensive repositioning. The weather compounded the uncertainty. Snow and freezing temperatures immobilized many vehicles, slowed marching troops, and rendered the already narrow forest roads slick and treacherous. German planners anticipated these conditions, stockpiling fuel and spare parts, training drivers in snow navigation, and coordinating artillery and infantry support to cover potential bottlenecks. Foggy mornings and bitter cold provided concealment, allowing armored columns to advance with minimal exposure. The forest's steep ridges and deep valleys, once considered obstacles, were now transformed into concealed avenues of attack. Every ridge became a potential overwatch position, every village a defensive stronghold, or a trap for the unwary. U.S. units stationed in the Ardennes were a mix of veteran and green divisions. Many soldiers had fought through Normandy, Brittany, and the push across France, yet the winter conditions, combined with the perceived quiet of the Ardennes, encouraged complacency. Patrols were brief, reconnaissance sporadic, and forward observation limited. Supply constraints further complicated defensive readiness. Ammunition, winter clothing, and artillery shells were funneled along narrow roads already choked with convoys. In effect, the forest's natural obstacles compounded the challenges of command while masking German preparations. German command emphasized speed and surprise. Panzer divisions would punch through initial American defenses along narrow roads, supported by infantry trained to exploit wooded terrain. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and engineer units followed closely, ensuring the armored spearheads could maintain momentum. Hitler's insistence on bold, concentrated thrusts meant that the operation depended on flawless timing. Delays could be catastrophic. Any delay could allow the Allies to mobilize reserves, fortify positions, and disrupt the German offensive. The stakes were as high as the winter winds that swept the ridges. On the American side, command decisions were constrained by assumptions about the forest. The Ardennes terrain had always been considered a buffer, a place where enemy activity was limited to small raids, not full-scale offensives. Troop movements were focused elsewhere, leaving gaps that German planners eagerly noted. Communication lines reliant on radio and wired networks were fragile in the snow and fog. Units were isolated in valleys, their ability to support each other restricted by the forest's natural choke points. In this environment, a sudden concentrated armored push could wreak havoc. Civilian life added another layer of complexity. Villages and towns scattered across the Ardennes were sparsely defended, their populations bracing for winter hardships. Refugees, displaced by prior Allied advances, moved cautiously through snow-covered roads, sometimes inadvertently revealing supply routes or troop positions. German planners factored in civilian movement, aiming to maintain operational secrecy while navigating inhabited areas. By mid-December, the Ardennes had transformed from a quiet backwater into a meticulously prepared battlefield. German armor was massed in secret, infantry dug in along ridges, engineers prepared roads and bridges, and the fog-laden forest offered perfect concealment. American forces, still underestimating the threat, remained scattered and cautious, unaware that the coming days would turn this forest into a crucible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the limits of technology and tactics, but also the endurance and courage of every soldier caught in the Ardennes' icy grip. In the coming hours, U.S. armored units would clash with German divisions in a sequence of battles defined by speed, surprise, and the unforgiving winter. The Ardennes, long considered impenetrable, was about to be pierced, and the consequences would ripple across the Western Front. For the soldiers on both sides, the Ardennes in winter was a crucible of endurance. American troops, many of them young and newly arrived, faced temperatures well below freezing, their breath crystallizing on their scarves and helmets. Frostbite claimed more men than enemy fire in some forward positions. Morale fluctuated with the snow, an endless silent landscape that magnified every sound and every shadow. German soldiers, equally cold and fatigued, moved with grim discipline. They believed in the impenetrable nature of the forest, yet each soldier knew the risk. One miscalculated maneuver or misfired shell could expose the entire column. Communication was often limited to shouted commands or crackling radio signals. Every man was acutely aware of the tension, the looming uncertainty that could erupt into violence at any moment. Amid the cold and fear, camaraderie became essential. Small gestures, sharing a cigarette, a flask of warm liquid, were lifelines in an unforgiving winter. The Ardennes terrain dictated the battle. Dense forests, narrow winding roads, and steep ridges created natural choke points and concealment for both attackers and defenders. German planners relied on these features, placing panzer divisions at key road junctions and ridgelines, while infantry secured flanks and villages. American commanders, constrained by incomplete intelligence, sought to protect vulnerable routes but underestimated the speed of a mechanized assault through snow-packed terrain. Tanks moving in column along narrow roads were vulnerable to ambush, artillery, and air attacks. But in the dense fog, visual detection was severely limited. Tactical innovation was crucial. Engineers cleared paths, scouts reported enemy positions, and radio operators coordinated artillery strikes to soften defenses. Every ridge and valley became a chessboard where movement, positioning, and timing determined life and death. Technology played a decisive role in the Ardennes. Sherman tanks, the backbone of U.S. armored units, were reliable and versatile, but underpowered against heavier German panzers in frontal combat. German Panzer IVs and Panthers, reinforced with sloped armor and high-velocity guns, excelled in the defensive forested terrain, exploiting narrow roads to maximize firepower. Both sides relied on artillery, radios, and engineering vehicles to coordinate movement and maintain supply lines. The snow and ice challenged machinery. Tanks struggled with traction, engines froze, and tracks became clogged. Engineers adapted with makeshift solutions, wooden planks for traction, heated fuel containers, and field repairs. Communication technology, especially radios, became a lifeline, allowing commanders to respond rapidly to shifting situations in a battlefield. where visibility rarely exceeded a few hundred meters. Command decisions in the Ardennes exemplified the stark contrast between calculated audacity and cautious inaction. German leaders, from Hitler's directives to von Manteuffel's field execution, emphasized bold thrusts and concentrated armored attacks. Their strategy relied on surprise and the ability to maintain momentum through the forest. American commanders, including Generals Hodges and Patton, faced the challenge of defending an underestimated sector while coordinating reserves and responding to unexpected breakthroughs. The forest amplified the consequences of every decision. A misjudged advance could isolate a unit, while rapid, decisive leadership could exploit German vulnerabilities. Orders were transmitted through fragile radio lines, often under fire, demanding clarity, speed, and adaptability. Leadership became the difference between contained skirmishes and cascading collapse. The German perspective was shaped by overconfidence and desperation. They believed the Ardennes' natural obstacles ensured security, but logistical constraints, fuel shortages, and the inexperience of some divisions created hidden vulnerabilities. German forces sought to exploit perceived gaps in the Allied line, advancing swiftly along concealed forest roads. Yet every movement carried risk. Snow limited mobility, fog reduced coordination, and even minor mechanical failures could delay the offensive. The Ardennes presented both opportunity and danger. Commanders had to balance aggressive maneuver with the reality of winter attrition. The forest, while offering concealment, became a double-edged sword, amplifying the effects of missteps or delays. The Ardennes offensive was not fought in a vacuum. Civilians faced displacement, shortages, and exposure to sudden artillery fire. Soldiers encountered ethical dilemmas. Retreating units risked leaving wounded comrades behind, while advancing columns had to navigate inhabited villages without causing unnecessary harm. The winter amplified these challenges. Human endurance, compassion, and decision-making under stress were tested as deeply as military skill. Each choice, whether to fire, advance, or shelter, carried moral weight. In the snow, every life lost or saved resonated profoundly, leaving echoes that would survive long after the forest fell silent. As December deepened, soldiers endured not only enemy fire but the relentless winter. American troops, many inexperienced, learned quickly that the forest could be as lethal as the enemy. Frostbite, exhaustion, and hunger shadowed every patrol. Fear was constant. Each creaking tree, each distant thud of artillery amplified the unknown. Yet resilience emerged in small acts. Soldiers sharing rations, helping comrades dig trenches in frozen earth, or covering retreating units under machine gun fire. German troops, despite their confidence in the Ardennes defenses, felt the strain of extended marches and the cold's grip on machinery and morale. In the human calculus of war, endurance became a weapon as vital as the rifle or tank. The Ardennes demanded more than skill. It demanded courage, adaptability, and relentless perseverance. The battle's unfolding depended on exploiting terrain and timing. German armored columns moved along narrow forest roads, often in single-file lines, making them vulnerable to ambush but also hidden from aerial observation. American units faced the challenge of reacting to attacks with limited situational awareness. Engineers cleared snow-obstructed paths, artillery targeted concealed German positions, and infantry screened vulnerable flanks. Skirmishes erupted in villages, along ridges, and across frozen streams. The forest amplified both opportunities and hazards. Every ridge could conceal a tank ambush, every bend a hidden mine or artillery trap. Tactical superiority was determined not just by firepower, but by the ability to adapt rapidly to these conditions. Technology defined the possibilities and limitations of the Ardennes offensive. U.S. Sherman tanks, nimble and reliable, faced heavier German panzers, whose armor and guns dominated frontal engagements. Artillery support became critical, with both sides attempting to soften enemy positions before armored advances. Communications technology, particularly radios, dictated the pace of coordination. Snow and ice challenged mechanical reliability, requiring on-the-spot improvisation. Engineers and crews devised creative solutions to maintain mobility and firepower. Improvised tracks, heated engines, and constant maintenance under fire. In the Ardennes, technology could decide life or death, but only when wielded with skill, timing, and an understanding of the forest's unforgiving terrain. Leadership shaped outcomes in the Ardennes as acutely as any weapon. German commanders, driven by Hitler's directives, emphasized rapid armored thrusts and the exploitation of perceived Allied weaknesses. Patton alerted to the forest's vulnerability, coordinated rapid troop movements to respond to breakthroughs, while Hodges balanced defensive priorities with counteroffensive potential. Decisions were executed under extreme uncertainty. Fog obscured sightlines, roads choked with snow-laden vehicles, and communication lines were fragile. A single decision, a delayed order, a miscalculated movement, or a bold initiative could shift the momentum dramatically. Leadership became a test of judgment, endurance, and the ability to synchronize dispersed forces under pressure. The German command, confident in the Ardennes' natural defenses, underestimated both the potential of American armored units and the resilience of the soldiers in winter conditions. Their strategy relied on secrecy, speed, and concentrated attacks through narrow roads. But snow, fog, and mechanical failures slowed progress, exposing vulnerabilities. The U.S. forces, though initially caught off guard, rapidly adapted to forest combat. Reconnaissance, artillery, and small unit tactics began to offset German advantages. Every miscalculation by the attackers became a potential opportunity for the defenders, while the defenders' delays threatened to magnify the German gamble. The interplay of misjudgment and adaptability framed the coming breakthroughs, where opportunity and risk converged in moments of extreme intensity. The Ardennes offensive was not simply a battle of strategy or machinery. It was a test of humanity under extreme conditions. Civilians endured displacement, exposure, and the terror of sudden bombardment. Soldiers faced ethical dilemmas: how to advance through occupied villages, whether to risk lives for comrades, how to prioritize survival against mission objectives. Every decision carried weight beyond immediate tactical concerns. Compassion, courage, and ethical choices existed alongside bullets and artillery shells. The forest, beautiful in its winter silence, concealed profound suffering and moral complexity, reminding both soldiers and commanders that the cost of war extended far beyond strategic lines on a map. By examining these perspectives together, the Ardennes emerges not merely as a geographical challenge but as a complex, multi-dimensional battlefield. Human endurance, tactical innovation, technological limitations, leadership decisions, enemy miscalculations, and moral dilemmas intertwined, setting the stage for the decisive breakthroughs that would define the winter of 1944. December 16, 1944, dawned with a heavy fog over the Ardennes. German artillery opened with sudden, deafening barrages on American forward positions, shattering the silence that had held for weeks. Snowflakes swirled through the smoke and dust, landing on frozen helmets and tank turrets alike. The Wehrmacht's plan moved into action. Armored columns advanced along narrow forest roads, aiming to punch through weak points in the American line. German tanks, supported by mechanized infantry and engineers, struck with speed, exploiting the element of surprise. American units scattered along the ridges and valleys were caught off guard. Many forward positions crumbled under combined artillery and armored assault. Radios crackled with frantic messages as officers coordinated defensive fire and attempted counterattacks. Sherman tanks, though outgunned by Panthers in frontal engagements, maneuvered through the forest's narrow corridors, using speed and coordination to avoid bottlenecks and ambushes. Infantry units pressed forward alongside them, laying suppressive fire and clearing paths through snow-choked roads. The first breakthrough occurred near the village of Clairvaux. German panzers smashed through roadblocks and destroyed lightly defended positions, forcing American units to withdraw under fire. The dense forest concealed their numbers, creating the illusion of unstoppable momentum. Yet the Americans adapted quickly, using artillery to harass advancing columns and small unit tactics to slow the enemy. Engineers demolished bridges to delay movement, while reconnaissance teams scouted flanks to anticipate German maneuvers. Every ridge and crossroads became a micro-battle, a clash of maneuver, firepower, and human endurance. By midday, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the scale of the conflict. Columns of German armor snaked through snow-laden valleys, while American tanks attempted to intercept them along choke points. Skirmishes erupted in villages and forests alike. Machine gun nests, anti-tank positions, and artillery batteries engaged in rapid exchanges, leaving shattered buildings and frozen craters in their wake. Communications became critical. Commanders had to balance aggressive counterattacks with the preservation of their units. One wrong order could isolate a battalion or expose an entire column to destruction. Leadership decisions proved decisive. General Patton, alerted to the Ardennes breakthrough, began redirecting reserves and coordinating with Hodges to stabilize threatened sectors. American artillery units, despite the initial shock, targeted German columns with precision, disrupting momentum and forcing tactical pauses. In the forest, snow and fog limited visibility, but both sides relied on maps, reconnaissance, and experience to guide movement. German officers pressed for rapid advancement, believing in the forest's protection, while American leaders emphasized cohesion and counterstrike. Every decision played out amid the roar of engines, the crunch of snow under treads, and the staccato of gunfire. Technology clashed in dramatic fashion. Sherman tanks, vulnerable in frontal engagements, relied on maneuvering along forest roads, flanking heavier German panzers where possible. Engineers cleared debris and reinforced fragile bridges to maintain supply lines, while artillery observers coordinated strikes to halt enemy advances. Radio operators relayed orders under fire, ensuring that units could react to the fluid battlefield. Yet the winter imposed severe constraints. Frozen engines stalled, tracks slipped on ice, and shells sometimes froze in their tubes. The forest's harsh conditions became a weapon in themselves, testing the limits of both men and machines. Human endurance defined the first hours of the breakthrough. Soldiers dug trenches under artillery fire, carried wounded comrades through snow, and faced the psychological strain of uncertainty and sudden violence. Fear and exhaustion were constant companions, yet small acts of courage, covering a retreat, holding a machine gun nest, rescuing a trapped tank crew, shaped the flow of the battle. Civilians caught in the crossfire, huddled in homes or fled along narrow roads, adding to the chaos. The forest, silent and foreboding only hours before, had transformed into a theater of relentless intensity. By evening, the first German armored columns had reached critical positions along key roads, yet their advance had begun to slow. American defenses, while battered, held strategically important points. Artillery barrages disrupted supply and fuel lines, while Sherman tanks and infantry units executed counterattacks in forest clearings. The initial momentum of the offensive was tempered by winter, terrain, and the resilience of defenders. Both sides understood that the following hours would determine whether the Ardennes would remain a fortress or become a corridor of devastation. The forest, once thought impenetrable, had been pierced. German armor had achieved initial success, but the battle was far from decided. The interplay of human courage, tactical innovation, technological limits, and leadership decisions created a precarious balance, one that would tip in the coming days. The Ardennes, shrouded in snow and fog, became a crucible where every choice, every maneuver, and every moment of endurance carried immense consequence. The stage was set for the climactic push of U.S. armored forces, an operation that would transform the Ardennes from a feared defensive barrier into a breached front, forcing the Germans into rapid retreat. The following morning, December 17, 1944, brought a brittle clarity to the Ardennes. The fog lifted just enough to reveal the full scale of the battle. German armored units, having achieved initial breakthroughs, faced the stark reality of winter combat. Roads clogged with damaged vehicles, artillery strikes interrupting supply lines, and American forces regrouping behind ridges and in villages. The Wehrmacht's momentum, once seeming unstoppable, now encountered fierce resistance that would test the limits of coordination and endurance. American armored units began executing a carefully timed counteroffensive. Sherman tanks, moving in tight columns and supported by infantry, advanced along cleared forest paths to intercept German panzers. Artillery observers, braving icy ridges, directed precise barrages onto German positions, neutralizing pockets of resistance. Engineers reinforced bridges, cleared fallen trees, and repaired tracks under fire, ensuring mobility for the advancing columns. Communication, though disrupted by the chaos, was maintained through a mix of radios and runners, allowing commanders to synchronize attacks across multiple ridges and valleys. The village of Bastogne became a focal point. Encircled by German forces, American paratroopers held critical positions, preventing complete envelopment and buying time for armor to maneuver. Supply drops, coordinated under harrowing conditions, kept ammunition and food flowing to the defenders. German commanders, expecting a rapid collapse of resistance, were forced to adapt, diverting forces to breach Bastogne's defenses. This delay proved decisive. It allowed U.S. armored units to flank weaker German positions and disrupt the cohesion of the offensive. By December 18th, the rhythm of combat intensified. Skirmishes erupted along every forest road and ridge. Sherman tanks used maneuver and concentrated fire to engage heavier panzers from angles that minimized exposure. Infantry squads cleared ambush points and supported armored advances with suppressive fire. Snow, ice, and shell-cratered roads slowed progress for both sides, but the Americans used terrain to their advantage, creating choke points for German columns and cutting off isolated units. The interplay of mobility, firepower, and terrain mastery began to shift the battle decisively. Leadership under pressure shaped every moment. General Patton, leveraging his understanding of armored warfare, redirected units to exploit gaps in German lines, while local commanders coordinated counterattacks to prevent encirclement. German leaders, constrained by Hitler's insistence on rapid advance and the fog of forested terrain, faced growing confusion. Miscommunication, mechanical failures, and the resilience of American forces eroded the initial advantage. Every hour brought attrition, forcing the Germans to choose between pressing the offensive or consolidating under increasingly adverse conditions. By December 19th, U.S. armored units had fully pierced the Ardennes defensive network in multiple sectors. Villages and crossroads that had initially fallen to German forces were retaken. Sherman tanks, often outmatched in direct confrontation, leveraged numbers, mobility, and coordinated artillery to regain control of critical terrain. Engineers maintained supply routes through frozen forests, allowing continuous reinforcement. Infantry units pressed attacks along flanks, isolating German armor and forcing withdrawals. The forest, once a shield for the Wehrmacht, now funneled retreating units into bottlenecks, amplifying the effectiveness of American firepower. The human toll was immense. Soldiers on both sides suffered frostbite, exhaustion, and injuries from relentless engagements. Casualties mounted in villages reduced to rubble, along snow-crusted roads and across frozen streams. Civilians, trapped in the crossfire, faced displacement and loss, adding to the battle's grim reality. Yet amidst the chaos, acts of courage and endurance continued. Soldiers rescuing comrades, engineers repairing tracks under fire, medics navigating snow to reach the wounded. Each action, each decision, shaped the battlefield's unfolding drama. By December 20th, the German offensive had effectively collapsed. The rapid thrust through the Ardennes, once the centerpiece of Hitler's winter gamble, had been halted and reversed. U.S. armored units pressed forward, exploiting every gap, retaking towns, and re-establishing control over critical supply routes. The combination of human resilience, tactical acumen, technological adaptation, and decisive leadership had transformed the forest from a symbol of impenetrability into a breached front, signaling a turning point in the Western European campaign. The Ardennes, long believed by the Germans to be a natural fortress, had yielded under pressure. The clash of armor, infantry, and artillery, conducted in bitter winter conditions, revealed the limits of audacity against preparation and adaptability. What began as a German gamble had evolved into a decisive test of endurance, strategy, and coordination, a crucible where the outcome depended not solely on firepower, but on the effective integration of human, technological, and leadership factors. As snow continued to fall over the ridges and villages, silence began to reclaim the forest. The roar of engines and gunfire gave way to cautious patrols and the grim work of counting losses and securing territory. The breakthrough was complete, but its lessons about surprise, terrain, winter conditions, and human resilience would resonate far beyond the Ardennes. The stage was now set for understanding the aftermath, the consequences of victory and defeat, the toll on soldiers and civilians, and the strategic implications for the remainder of the war. By late December 1944, the Ardennes forest bore the scars of one of the most intense winter engagements of the Second World War. Snow-covered ridges and villages were littered with the remnants of tanks, artillery, and vehicles abandoned under fire. The German offensive, once heralded as a daring gamble, had failed to achieve its objectives. Antwerp remained in Allied hands, supply lines were restored, and the American forces had regained control over key roads and strategic positions. The initial shock of the breakthrough had given way to a hard-fought stabilization, reflecting both the resilience of the U.S. Army and the limits of German winter warfare. Casualties were severe on both sides, though the balance heavily favored the Americans. Estimates indicate that German losses in the Ardennes offensive ranged from 80,000 to 100,000 men, including killed, wounded, and captured. With significant tank and artillery losses, American forces suffered approximately 75,000 casualties, including frostbite and exposure-related injuries, reflecting the brutality of winter combat as much as enemy action. Villages and towns caught in the crossfire faced destruction and displacement. Civilian accounts describe homes reduced to rubble, roads blocked by wreckage, and families forced to survive amidst chaos. The forest that had been a concealing shroud for German forces had become a corridor of destruction, revealing the costs of audacity against prepared resistance. The immediate military consequences were stark. German forces forced into retreat, abandoned positions along ridges and valleys, leaving behind artillery, armored vehicles, and supplies. The collapse of their offensive opened the Western Front to renewed Allied advances. U.S. armored units, despite logistical challenges, maintained momentum, pressing forward along cleared forest roads and reclaiming previously lost towns. Engineers and artillery units worked continuously to restore supply lines and reinforce positions, ensuring that German counterattacks could not regain initiative. The Ardennes, once thought impenetrable, had been traversed and controlled, transforming the perception of natural barriers in modern warfare. Reports and testimonies from both sides capture the intensity of the engagement. German officers writing in postwar accounts acknowledged the combination of surprise terrain and American resilience that halted their advance. Soldiers described snow-choked roads, relentless artillery fire, and the psychological strain of fighting in dense, unforgiving forests. American memoirs emphasized the challenges of winter combat, coordinating armor and infantry, maintaining supply lines, and countering the initial shock of the German offensive. These accounts converge on a common theme. The Ardennes was a battlefield defined not only by strategic objectives, but by endurance, improvisation, and human determination. Strategically, the failure of the German offensive marked a turning point. Hitler's hope of splitting the Allied front and forcing negotiations evaporated under the pressure of sustained American resistance and the resilience of the U.S. armored units. The Ardennes demonstrated the limits of surprise and audacity when confronted with logistical planning, technological adaptation, and effective leadership. It also exposed the vulnerabilities of relying on natural terrain as a defensive shield without accounting for the enemy's capacity to adapt. The human dimension remained central to understanding the aftermath. Soldiers faced the grim task of burying the dead, repairing vehicles, and treating the wounded amidst freezing temperatures. Civilians, having endured bombardment and displacement, struggled to return to normalcy while assessing the damage to their homes and communities. Frostbite, malnutrition, and exposure added layers of suffering that official casualty figures could not fully capture. Yet amidst the destruction, resilience persisted. Engineers repaired roads, supply units restored movement, and troops prepared for the next phase of the campaign. The Ardennes winter battles also left lasting lessons for military planners. The importance of reconnaissance, understanding terrain, integrating infantry and armor, and maintaining logistics under extreme conditions became clear. Commanders learned that even dense forests and frozen roads could not guarantee invulnerability, and that flexibility, speed, and adaptability often determined outcomes more than the sheer size of a force. By the end of December, the forest had quieted, but its story was far from over. The initial shock of the German breakthrough had faded, replaced by an understanding of both its audacity and its limitations. The Ardennes had tested soldiers, machines, and commanders alike, leaving a legacy of tactical and human lessons that would inform the remainder of the Western European campaign. The battle's aftermath naturally led into broader consequences, psychological, strategic, and operational, that shaped the next phase of the war. The Ardennes was no longer merely a forest. It had become a symbol of both human endurance and the high cost of miscalculation. In the weeks following the Ardennes offensive, the psychological impact on both sides became increasingly evident. German troops, once confident in the forest's natural defenses, faced the demoralizing reality of retreat. Exhaustion, frostbite, and the loss of tanks and artillery compounded their sense of failure. Commanders struggled to regroup shattered units, reconcile the loss of momentum, and maintain discipline under harsh winter conditions. Letters and memoirs from German soldiers reveal frustration and disbelief. The impenetrable Ardennes had been breached, and the consequences of misjudgment weighed heavily on every decision that followed. American forces, while victorious, were equally tested. Soldiers contended with extreme cold, injuries, and the psychological strain of sudden engagements. Yet the successful counterattacks fostered confidence and cohesion. Units that had initially been scattered learned to coordinate rapidly, integrating armor, infantry, and artillery under pressure. Leaders who made decisive choices, like Patton and Hodges, earned lasting respect, their decisions directly contributing to the containment and reversal of the German offensive. The human capacity to adapt, endure, and exploit opportunity became as crucial as any weapon on the battlefield. Strategically, the Ardennes breakthrough reshaped the Western Front. The failure of the German offensive meant that Antwerp remained in Allied hands, securing vital supply lines for the advancing armies. German resources were depleted, armored units destroyed or immobilized, and morale eroded across the front. The Allies regained the initiative, shifting from defensive operations to renewed offensive planning for the invasion of Germany itself. The Ardennes campaign demonstrated the limits of bold, isolated maneuvers when confronted by resilient, adaptable opposition, supported by coordinated logistics and terrain awareness. Winter conditions had amplified both the human and operational challenges. Snow and ice hindered movement, damaged equipment, and complicated supply chains. Yet these same conditions, initially thought to favor the defenders, became manageable through careful planning, improvisation, and resilience. Engineers repaired roads and bridges under fire. Medics navigated frozen forests to reach the wounded. Radio operators maintained fragile communication lines that were critical for coordinated action. Technology, terrain, and human endurance intersected, shaping outcomes in ways that planners on both sides had underestimated. Civilian populations experienced profound disruption. Towns and villages bore the scars of bombardment, vehicle wreckage, and occupation by both advancing and retreating forces. Displacement, exposure to the elements, and loss of property were widespread. Relief efforts, coordinated by Allied military units and local authorities, sought to restore basic necessities, but the psychological toll endured. Civilians witnessed acts of courage and brutality alike, their lives intertwined with the fortunes of armies navigating the forest. The Ardennes also imparted enduring lessons for military leadership and planning. The offensive highlighted the dangers of overconfidence in natural terrain, the necessity of flexible command structures, and the critical importance of timely intelligence. German reliance on audacious strategy without accounting for logistical and environmental constraints led to failure, while American adaptability and coordination turned initial shock into decisive advantage. These lessons would influence operational planning in the final campaigns of the European theater, emphasizing the integration of intelligence, technology, and human factors in complex environments. By the end of December 1944, the Ardennes stood as a testament to both human endurance and the unforgiving logic of modern warfare. What had begun as a German gamble became a crucible of resilience for the Americans, a vivid example of how preparation, adaptability, and leadership could transform apparent vulnerability into opportunity. The forest, once feared as impenetrable, had revealed its dual nature, a concealing barrier and simultaneously a testing ground for the limits of strategy and human endurance. As Allied forces consolidated gains and the German army withdrew, the broader significance of the Ardennes campaign became clear. It had halted Hitler's last major gamble on the Western Front, preserved critical supply lines, and demonstrated the decisive value of integrated operations under extreme conditions. The battle's aftermath rippled through subsequent planning, shaping approaches to both winter operations and armored warfare, while leaving an indelible mark on the soldiers who endured its trials. The forest had quieted, but the lessons and consequences of its frozen ridges and snow-laden valleys endured, setting the stage for reflection on the human, technological, and strategic dimensions of one of the most remarkable winter campaigns in history. The Ardennes forest, once considered an impassable barrier, had been pierced, not by sheer luck but by human endurance, tactical ingenuity, and coordinated action. In the icy grip of December 1944, soldiers on both sides confronted the stark realities of war, the fragility of morale, the unforgiving limits of terrain, and the interplay of technology and leadership under pressure. The forest became more than a battlefield. It was a crucible, testing every decision, every maneuver, and every human instinct for survival and courage. The breakthrough of U.S. armored units revealed a profound truth about modern warfare. Natural obstacles, no matter how imposing, could not substitute for strategy, adaptability, and the integration of forces. German confidence in the Ardennes' impenetrability, reinforced by maps and assumptions, was shattered by the reality of determined, flexible opposition. Conversely, the Americans' capacity to adapt under duress, to combine armor, infantry, and artillery with speed and coordination, transformed apparent vulnerability into decisive advantage. Every ridge held a lesson, every frozen road a testament to the weight of preparation, improvisation, and leadership. Beyond tactics and strategy, the Ardennes highlighted the human dimension of war. Fear and exhaustion were ever-present companions, yet acts of courage and resilience, rescuing comrades, holding critical positions, repairing vital infrastructure, shaped the course of events as much as any artillery barrage or tank engagement. Civilians bore witness to this crucible, enduring displacement, destruction, and uncertainty, their lives entwined with the decisions of distant commanders and the actions of soldiers navigating snow-choked valleys. Ultimately, the Ardennes offensive left a legacy that extended beyond the winter of 1944. It underscored the limits of hubris, the necessity of preparation, and the decisive power of human determination. The forest had tested strategy, machinery, and morale alike, revealing that even the most audacious plans could falter when confronted with resilient, adaptive opposition. In the quiet that followed the snow-laden ridges, the Ardennes remained a symbol, not of defeat or victory alone, but of the enduring interplay between human courage, ingenuity, and the harsh realities of warfare. History remembers it not merely as a battlefield, but as a crucible of endurance and a lesson in the profound consequences of strategy, leadership, and human resolve.